Half-a-day students, I am Governor Lou Leon Guerrero. You all have been through a year of big changes. We've had to adapt and make big changes to keep our families and our island safe. But with change comes opportunity and a chance to try new things like PBS University. While Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio and I will continue to do our part to keep our island safe, you students have a part to play as well. Your part is to keep learning and to keep up with your lessons. That's why I am happy to see you here ready to learn with PBS University. PBS University is a way to bring a continuous educational curriculum to you while you stay safe at home during this time. To help you keep up with your studies, we asked our friends at PBS Guam and the Guam Department of Education to put together this episode. Thank you for doing your part and have a great lesson.
Humanities Guåhan, an independent nonprofit organization affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities, is dedicated to promoting public humanities programming for the people of Guam and providing foundational support and educational resources for our island community. For more information about Humanities Guåhan, visit www.humanitiesguahan.org. The following webinar series is part of a project presented by Humanities Guåhan entitled Unincorporated, Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan. This project explores Chamorro stories, experiences, and perspectives on civic engagement in relation to voting rights, democracy, political status, and Chamorro self-determination. Unincorporated consisted of the 5-part webinar series that took place from January through May 2021 and covered topics on the origins of Chamorro self-determination, the work of the Commission on Decolonization, the relationship between art and decolonization, and the role of the U.S. legal system as it relates to Guam's political status. The project culminated with the launch of an online and printed magazine distributed throughout the community, which consists of essays, creative reflections, and artwork exploring issues around Guåhan's political status and decolonization through the perspectives and historical and political experiences of the Chamorro people of Guåhan.
Then you had the elective governorship in 1970, and then what they did is in exchange for giving the people of Guam the right to have elective governorship, they eliminated the provision on giving preference in GovGuam employment to persons of Guamanian ancestry. And then they applied the 15th Amendment, which is the amendment that Dave Davis used in his lawsuit, which is referring to voting rights. So that's what happened in creating the elective governorship. Then the elected delegate was created in 1972. Of course, Congressman Wampat was the first elected delegate. There was increased reliance on federal funding and participation as a determination of progress. All elected officials in Guam said, you elect me to office, I'll go and I'll get you more money. I'll get you more money from the feds. And that was seen as like, and it's still the same. The more money we get from the feds, it's the more successful as an elected official I am, because that was seen as the determination of progress. And in explaining why the people of Guam should get more money from the federal government than they currently get, there was always used the justification for loyalty in World War II. Mr. Wampat was particularly adept at this. Every time there was some new funding program for Guam, he would point out that the people of Guam suffered for America in World War II. And there was Guam's strategic value, of course, and then participation in the Korean, Vietnam Wars. And then I don't know what that subs refers to there. I should clean up that part of the PowerPoint. But so strategic value and participation in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. So the justification as for loyalty in World War II, people of Guam were very proud of their role in in World War II and used it to great effect to say the people of Guam are special because their loyalty to the United States was tested in ways that no one else was tested. And they came through in flying colors. And that's why we deserve more money, more freedom. And it became kind of part of the cornerstone of political philosophy. And of course, a lot of it depended on your attitude too. I remember Governor Ricky Bordallo coming back from a trip to Washington, D.C. one time. This was one of the greatest lines I've ever heard. A reporter asked, because Governor Bordallo typically I went to Washington, I got this funding. Everybody has to get funding when they go to Washington. They come back, they have to report that they got something. So everybody, I got this. And a reporter asked him, says, Governor Bordallo, when you go to Washington, aren't you tired of begging for more money? He looked at him, he said, when I go to Washington, I don't beg, I go collecting. So it's your attitude. So he was a collector, maybe the others were beggars, who knows? But this is so different than the next slide. So now you have, well, you're now going to change your political status. All of a sudden, the Micronesians who were disloyal or seen as sort of on the Japanese side in World War II, because they were part of the Japanese mandate, especially the people in the Northern Marianas, and they were getting high-level attention. These Washington, D.C. officials would come to Guam, but would start coming to Guam in the late 60s. And they would land on Guam, and then they'd go right up to Saipan and start negotiating with the Trust Territory officials, the Congress of Micronesia. What is it that you want to be? What political status do you have? And the people of Guam looked like chumps. They said, what good was being loyal? We weren't rewarded for anything. We're not getting any high-level conversation. Nobody's paying attention to us. So the Guam legislature decided, well, we'll just create a process. So they passed Public Law 1217, the Political Status Commission, which basically didn't really do anything except they just wrote, and this was a Paul Bordallo idea. That guy was amazing. He did a lot in one term. So Paul Bordallo created this commission, and they wrote articles about political status options. Then when they were going to give the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, they were going to give them super status. And remember that in 1968, the people of Guam were asked, do you want to reunite with the Northern Marianas? And the people of Guam said no, because they're way too poor and it will be a drag on our economy. And besides, a lot of them were collaborators with the Japanese. So now those people who were alleged collaborators with the Japanese are now all of a sudden getting high-level negotiations in order to create a commonwealth. There's just no fairness in this system. So a lot of people in Guam thought. And President Ford assured everybody that whatever the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas gets, Guam should get at least the same. That's the so-called secret offer. Well, that secret offer was so secret, nobody ever heard about it after President Ford. So that died with the administration of President Carter. So somebody had to do something with the territories, because the Trust Territory, and there was going to create the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, something had to happen. So the Congress, US Congress, decided to assert its authority over this process. This process of political status negotiation was always seen as something that the president did, the executive branch did. So the Congress said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to offer the small territories a constitution. So they passed a law creating a constitutional convention. And so the next slide. So you had public law, US Public Law 94-584, and then they created the opportunity for Guam and the Virgin Islands to elect delegates and form a constitution. Guam formed a constitution and it was defeated. The Virgin Islands formed a constitution, and then they tried to form 4 more constitutions subsequent to that, and each one has been defeated. So this has not been a highly productive route for either of the small territories. But at the time, it looked like it was a possibility. So when the Guam Constitutional Convention was going on, the US State Department said, wow, this is great, because if the people of Guam pass the Guam Constitution, we can take Guam off the list of non-self-governing territories because they will be fully self-governing. This is great. This is a real opportunity. So the US State Department invited a UN delegation to come and observe the election of the Constitution in anticipation that the Constitution was going to pass. But of course, Para Pada, myself, and a number of other people, and Tony Leon Guerrero and Marilyn Manabusan and a number of other people, we worked together and we defeated the Constitution, and by a 5-to-1 margin. So they weren't able to take Guam off the list of non-self-governing territories. That was the sub-story to that. But what happened was that we met, especially Tony Leon Guerrero and I, met the UN delegation for the first. We had several meetings with them. And there was a guy named Mr. Swai. He worked for the committee, the UN committee. And he explained to us the whole system. It was like a new world. What? We never heard of this. You mean there's a UN resolution 1541 to end, to a declaration to provide self-determination and independence to territories? We never heard of this. And we heard about the UN being on the list of non-self-governing territories. So Mr. Swai, we had was very instructive for us. Mr. Swai called Tony Leon Guerrero. Mr. Swai was from Tanzania. He called Tony Leon Guerrero Simba. And Mr. Swai called me Mwamba. And Simba in Swahili means lion. Of course, because Tony had a wraparound beard, and he was ferocious, and he was on. Mwamba meant rock. So Mr. Swai said, yeah, you're the intellectual foundation of this. So he called me Mwamba. So Mwamba and Simba, learned a lot from Mr. Swai. That's why I put him in here. And we learned a lot about the UN Resolution 1541. Okay, so then next slide. Well, I went to the UN. That's what happened. So let's go visit Mr. Swai and his friends. So I went to the UN, obviously a much different person than I look today, but I went to the UN along with Chris Paris Howard and Ron Tehan. And by that time, we had organized I was the first petitioner to go to the UN in a way that was seen as adversarial to the United States government. And so a lot of people were predicting doom and gloom to me. If you go, you're never going to amount to anything. The FBI will follow you around for the rest of your life, and you're never going to amount to anything. Your career will be ruined. Of course, 10 years later, I was elected to Congress. And then after that, I also became president of the university. So apparently my career was not successfully ruined. But that was a very interesting time period. Next slide. So that's the Resolution 1541 reports of the principles which guide whether or not an obligation to transmit the international called for Article 73, and then to go over to the Declaration of Independence and Self-Determination. So by now, the term self-determination is in full use, and so that's the basis for that. And introducing that concept to Guam and CHamoru self-determination was, next slide, please, the creation of the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights. So we, in a sense, we found out about the UN process. We created OPR. There's a number of people involved in OPR. I hesitate to name all of them because then, somebody will be left out and then they'll feel bad. But there were a lot of people involved, and Narissa was part of that too, and Hope Cristobal, Chris Paris Howard, and Bernadita Dunca, Rosa Palomo, Marie Pablo, who went into the Carmelites later on, Phil Gutierrez, Clotilde Gu, just David Rosario, a number of people who were involved in this. And as a result of that, and as a result of the failure of the Constitution, the public law, Guam Public Law, PL 15-128, decided to create the Commission on Self-Determination. So now Guam has decided they're going to do something. This is novel. See, this is really, now we're going to create a process of self-determination. And so the governor will be largely in charge of the process. And the first meeting, one of the members was Richard Taitano from the legislature. And he asked the commission, who is the self in self-determination? And they all kind of like, well, I don't know, we don't know who. Well, if you don't know who the self is, then how can you exercise self-determination? Who's the self? Who are we talking about? Who was denied the right to self-determination? Who was conquered? Who historically and legally has a claim to this right to self-determination? And since they couldn't answer it, Richard Taitano said, until you answer it, I'm not coming back. And he never came back because they never really answered it. So then this process eventually led to the drafting of the Commonwealth Draft Act. So the Commonwealth Draft Act was then the inevitable process, and they created a process where, you had a whole series of choices. People went to vote, and then they had a runoff between the top two choices, and the top two choices were statehood and Commonwealth. Commonwealth won, and then they drafted an act called the Commonwealth Draft Act, and it had 12 articles and a whole other series of things created out of that, but ultimately was not successful either. So we'll end at this point, and we'll take some questions, and then we'll go to the final segment of this.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions. I just want to announce or just remind the group that some of these questions there have been really great questions coming in. Some of them we'll save for the third segment of the conversation. But one of the questions that's come in that I think is very interesting is, can you share with us your thoughts on why US citizenship was the major goal of Guam's political leadership after the war, after World War II?
Well, it seemed, first of all, it seemed like a natural thing to deal with since it began before the war with BJ Leon Guerrero, Tun BJ, and Tun Kiko Suilo had both gone before World War II as well. It seemed like they were convinced that if they were US citizens, that they would not be treated in an arbitrary fashion. So that's why citizenship, and it's hard to say because I don't want to create a different argument here, but it wasn't like we want to be American, quote American, and whatever that meant at the time, as much as we just want to be relieved of this kind of arbitrary treatment by local military officials. Interestingly, American Samoa had the same opportunity, but they came up with a totally different conclusion. The people of Guam were really suffering a lot from the the arbitrary land taking, and they concluded that if we were US citizens, we wouldn't be treated so badly in terms of the land takings. In American Samoa, they said, we don't want to be US citizens because if we became US citizens, they're going to bring in land tenure from the states and our traditional land system will be destroyed. So they said, we don't want to be citizens, just keep us something else. And so they kept the so-called national status, which they have today, which is part of another lawsuit, which is winding its way around the court system as well. But the people of Guam and the people of American Samoa were both having land concerns, and they came to opposite decisions about what citizenship meant. So I don't know. In that sense, maybe the people in American Samoa were a little bit ahead of the game.
We'll see where that ends up too. But the other question that came in, I think this is really good. What would have happened, looking back, what do you think would have happened if the Guam Constitution, if the Constitution was passed?
We'd be off the non-self-governing list, and doesn't mean that the political status question would go away, but you'd have a different, I believe that you'd have a different quality to the government of Guam today, in which case people will say the issue of CHamoru self-determination is no longer a live issue because this has been a qualitatively different, not under the right of conquest. There's been some consent given by the people of Guam to the government that they have. So it's sort of interesting because the people of the Northern Marianas, and I don't want to create an argument where one doesn't exist, but do the people of the Northern Marianas still have the right to self-determination? Do they have the indigenous right to self-determination? And some would say, no, they've already exercised it. They created the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. What, do they get another shot at it? Are they going to get another crack at it? Yes, that issue. But of course, for Guam, they've never gotten that shot. So I think that issue would have been foreclosed. It'd be an open question as to whether or not you'd have better government. The Constitution as drafted was not an awful document. The delegates did give their best shot, but it was pretty easy to argue against because they had some arbitrary things in there that the opponents like myself could point to in debates.
Why would you say this is the process of self-determination is so reliant on the United Nations and its pronouncements?
Because the right of conquest, is it's like, do you have the right to exercise arbitrary power over a people, over a dependent people? And the UN system has been to say that it doesn't. And the US sort of agrees to that, although they'll never say that they have colonies. They'll just say, well, we want them to be whatever they want to be, but it's not clear what they want to be. So that's why they're where they're at today. It's not a full-throated acknowledgement of the right to self-govern. And so that is the role of the UN in that. I don't think I'm under any
These webinars can be accessed on Humanities Guåhan's Facebook page. To view the online magazine associated with Unincorporated Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan, visit humanitiesguåhan.org/unincorporated.
Hafa students, I'm Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio. For more than a year now, you all have continued to wash your hands and watch your distance from others, and you've done a really great job wearing your masks. We know your parents and guardians have helped you to make these changes to keep yourself and your community safe. As Governor Leon Guerrero said, we are happy you are here. We want you to continue to learn and sharpen your skills with the help of PBS University. This program is the result of a collaborative effort. We couldn't do it alone. I'd like to thank the teachers and support staff of the Guam Department of Education and PBS Guam for their work and their commitment to our students. I'd also like to thank you students for participating at home. To your parents, I'd like to thank you for taking an active role in your child's education. We are all eager to return to a time when all of us can share and study together in person. Until then, we hope you learned something new from this PBS University instruction.